Before rockets reached the moon, before jet engines ruled the skies, there was one man who believed a single person, standing on the ground, could fly. In the early 1940s, the world was at war. Nations were racing not only to build better weapons, but to master new frontiers of technology, jet propulsion, rocketry, and aviation. It was an age of invention fueled by desperation. While scientists across Europe were working on jet planes and missiles, a small group of dreamers had their eyes on something far smaller and far stranger, a personal flying machine. One of them was a quiet engineer, Dr. Friedrich Schumann, a man whose dream was not to destroy but to give humans the power of flight itself. In his notebooks discovered decades later, one phrase appeared over and over again: the sky should belong to everyone. He was part scientist, part inventor, part idealist, and, as history would later show, perhaps a bit of a madman. What began as a harmless obsession with flight would soon draw the attention of the military, the intelligence services, and even rival nations. Because in the middle of World War II, Schumann claimed he had built something no one else had ever achieved, a working jetpack, a device that could lift a man off the ground using miniature rocket engines strapped to his back. For a few brief, incredible months in 1942, that dream came terrifyingly close to reality. And then, both Schumann and his invention disappeared. Some said he was captured, others claimed his laboratory exploded, but a few, even years later, swore they saw a man soaring over the mountains and on fire but flying. This is the forgotten story of the scientist who built a jetpack in 1942 and vanished. His name was Dr. Friedrich Schumann, a German-born aeronautical engineer with a mind years ahead of his time. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a spy. He was, above all else, a dreamer obsessed with flight. As a child in Dresden, he built paper wings, jumping off rooftops just to feel the wind lift him for a fraction of a second. At university, he studied fluid dynamics and combustion, but his professors called his theories romantic nonsense. They wanted him to build airplanes. He wanted to make a man fly without one. By the time World War II began, Schumann had become a quiet, eccentric engineer, working in a small test facility on the outskirts of Munich. He avoided politics, rarely spoke of the war, and spent his nights tinkering with what he called der Himmelgänger, the Skywalker. At first, no one took it seriously. His colleagues laughed at the idea of a soldier with rockets on his back, but Schumann kept refining the design, sketch after sketch, calculation after calculation. He used hydrogen peroxide and calcium permanganate as fuel, the same volatile mixture that German scientists were experimenting with for rocket-assisted takeoffs. Except Schumann wasn't thinking about planes. He wanted a man-portable propulsion system, one that could launch a person vertically for short bursts. Early experiments were disastrous. The engines overheated, the valves melted. One test dummy caught fire mid-launch, but slowly he made progress. According to the only surviving assistant, Carl Weber, Schumann eventually built a working prototype. 2 small cylindrical engines mounted on a reinforced backpack frame, controlled by a pair of hand valves. One cold morning in March 1942, Schumann decided to test it himself. He strapped it on, smiled, and said, "If I fall, make sure you tell them I was right." Then he pulled the lever. For a few seconds he lifted off the ground, just a few meters, wobbling in the air, before crashing into the snow. He was bruised, burned, but alive, and it worked. Within weeks, rumours of the flying man began circulating around local military offices. Soon, Schumann received a telegram, an invitation from Berlin. The military wanted to see his invention. That was the moment everything changed. In the spring of 1942, Dr. Friedrich Schumann was summoned to Berlin under direct orders from the Luftwaffe's Technisches Amt, the department responsible for experimental weapons and propulsion research. To most scientists, such an invitation would have been an honour, but for Schumann, it marked the beginning of something darker, the moment his dream of human flight became a weapon. At a heavily guarded airfield outside the city, Schumann presented his invention to a small group of military officials. He demonstrated the fuel system, the hand-controlled nozzles, and even short footage of his test flight, captured on an 8mm camera by his assistant. The officers were stunned. The concept sounded insane, but the footage didn't lie. A man, clearly visible, rising a few feet off the ground under his own power. Immediately, The project was classified. Schumann was assigned new quarters and a research budget. His workshop was moved to an underground facility near Nordhausen, a region that would later become infamous as part of the V2 rocket program. There, he worked in total secrecy. No records, no reports, no correspondence without approval. Only a handful of engineers were allowed to assist him. The project was given the code name Project Morgenstern, Project Morning Star. The military envisioned shock troops equipped with jetpacks, able to leap across rivers, scale walls, or attack from above. But Schumann had something else in mind. He wanted to perfect personal flight, not for war, but for the world that would come after it. In his diary, later found in the ruins of his lab, he wrote, "If man can stand alone in the air even for a moment, he is no longer bound by earth or politics." Still, the experiments continued. The second and third prototypes showed improvement, longer flight times, better control, and reduced back pressure. Yet each test carried enormous risk. One misfire, one leak, and the fuel would ignite instantly. Weber, his assistant, recalled, "He stopped using dummies. He said the human body had to be part of the equation. Every test could kill him, and he knew it." By late 1942, Schumann's jetpack could lift a man for nearly 30 seconds, an extraordinary achievement for the time. But the military was growing impatient. They wanted results they could use, not dreams. Schumann refused to weaponize the design. He ignored orders to adapt it for combat, focusing instead on flight stability and safety. That defiance would seal his fate. Because by early 1943, Project Morgenstern was abruptly shut down. The records were sealed, the lab emptied, and Schumann, along with all his prototypes, disappeared. No one knew why, not even Weber, who was transferred to a different facility overnight. He never saw his mentor again. When Project Morgenstern was suddenly terminated in early 1943, it was as if Friedrich Schumann had been erased from existence. The guards at the Nordhausen facility said he left one night with 2 trucks of equipment and a sealed military escort. Others insisted he never left at all, that his lab exploded during a failed test flight. But the truth was stranger. Weeks later, reports began to surface from mountain villages near the Harz region. Locals claimed to have heard a deafening roar, like a jet engine but smaller, closer. Some even swore they saw a man in a strange suit soaring low over the treetops, trailing smoke before vanishing into the mist. The authorities dismissed the stories as hysteria. Yet when Allied forces swept through the area in 1945, they discovered charred fragments of a metal backpack, partially fused to a human skeleton. The serial markings matched Schumann's prototype notes. But there was no definitive proof, no surviving documents, no official record of his death. In the years that followed, whispers about Schumann began to circulate in both East and West Germany. Some said he'd escaped, that he fled the collapsing Reich with his invention, perhaps smuggled out by Allied intelligence. Others believed he'd been captured and forced to work for one of the early Cold War powers. The US Air Force archives, declassified decades later, included a 1947 report titled Unidentified Individual Utilizing Rocket Propulsion Apparatus, Possible German Origin. It described an incident near the Austrian border where American pilots spotted a small airborne object resembling a man with exhaust trails. It lasted less than a minute before vanishing into the clouds. Coincidence? Maybe. But the resemblance was undeniable. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers were experimenting with compact rocket systems eerily similar to Schumann's theoretical notes. One Soviet scientist even admitted in the 1960s, "We were not the first. There was a man before us, but we never found him." Could Friedrich Schumann have survived, his invention scattered among the victors of a world war? Or did his creation die with him, buried in the ashes of a secret project no one was supposed to know about? To this day, no official record confirms his existence. But those who have seen the recovered fragments, small metal engines stamped with the word Morgenstern, believe otherwise. Because the technology was real, the question is, what happened to the man who made it? For decades, the story of Dr. Friedrich Schumann was dismissed as myth, a rumour born out of wartime chaos. Historians called him a fabrication, a ghost story told by former engineers to exaggerate their wartime work. But in the 1990s, new evidence began to surface. In an abandoned storage facility near Kassel, researchers uncovered a rusted metal crate stamped Project Morgenstern. Inside were fragments of handwritten notes, sketches, and an incomplete blueprint sheet showing a man wearing a dual-thruster jet apparatus. The handwriting matched known samples from Schumann's university records. One page stood out. A short entry, dated February 1943, read simply, "Tomorrow, the stars." That was the last line in his journal. After the war, several countries began experimenting with personal propulsion. In 1958, American engineer Wendell Moore developed the Bell rocket belt, widely recognized as the world's first jetpack. When journalists later compared Moore's prototype to Schumann's recovered notes, the designs were shockingly similar. Same placement of tanks, same valve controls, even the same thrust angles. Coincidence? Maybe. Or perhaps Schumann's research didn't vanish at all. Perhaps it was taken, absorbed into post-war programs through Operation Paperclip or Soviet counterpart efforts. Some historians claim that US intelligence quietly recovered the Morgenstern prototypes and integrated the principles into early rocket testing. Others believe Schumann was among the scientists relocated after the war. His name changed, his past erased. There's another theory, more chilling. In 1945, Allied troops discovered a sealed bunker near Nordhausen containing twisted metal frames and scorched concrete. Among the debris was a melted helmet fused with glass and a human skull still inside. Radiocarbon analysis decades later confirmed it was from the early 1940s. No identification tag, no record of who was in that bunker, but attached to the wall, faintly visible beneath the soot, was a hand-painted phrase in German, "Ich habe geflogen." I have flown. Today, aviation experts agree on one thing. For a single man to develop a functioning jetpack in 1942 would have been almost impossible, but not entirely. The chemistry, the engineering, the basic thrust physics all existed at the time. Schumann may not have flown across cities, but even lifting a few meters would have made him a pioneer decades ahead of his time. And if that's true, then the question isn't whether he built it. It's why the world tried so hard to forget him.